For generations, I Love Lucy has been remembered as a warm, wholesome sitcom that defined the golden age of television. Millions tuned in every week to watch the fiery-haired Lucille Ball and her lovable Cuban husband, Desi Arnaz, stumble through misadventures that ended with laughter echoing across living rooms. And standing right beside them, night after night, was the loyal neighbor, Ethel Mertz, played by Vivian Vance. On screen, she was cheerful, funny, the perfect sidekick to Lucy. But off-screen, the truth was far more complicated, and the role that brought Vivian Vance fame also chained her to decades of pain, insecurity, and resentment. What most people never realized is that behind Ethel's bright smile, Vivian Vance carried a heavy secret. She hated what the role was doing to her life. To the audience, she was the beloved best friend, but to Vivian herself, she was trapped in a character she despised. She wanted to be glamorous. She wanted to be respected as an actress in her own right. But Hollywood had other plans. And the worst part? She had to play opposite William Frawley, who portrayed her on-screen husband, Fred Mertz, a man 30 years her senior, a man she loathed, and a man who made her life on set miserable. Vivian Vance's story is not just about an actress in a famous sitcom. It's about the cruel irony of fame, how the very thing that makes you a household name can also destroy your sense of self. For years, she smiled for the cameras, laughed at Lucy's antics, and delivered the punchlines. But when the lights went out, she confessed to close friends that the role of Ethel Mertz had left her feeling humiliated, typecast, and invisible. Even her relationship with Lucille Ball, the woman she appeared inseparable from on screen, was full of contradictions. Lucy and Vivian were allies, yes, but they were also rivals, with a quiet tension that grew over the years. Lucy was the star, the face of the empire, and Vivian was the sidekick who would never shine brighter than her. Some nights, Vivian went home furious, feeling like a supporting character not just on TV, but in her own life. And yet, despite all this, she couldn't walk away. I Love Lucy wasn't just a job. It was a cultural phenomenon, the most watched show in America. If she left, she risked disappearing forever in an industry that rarely gave second chances, especially to women. So Vivian stayed. Even as the role gnawed at her dignity, she stayed through the cruel jokes about her weight, through the uncomfortable dynamic with Frawley, through the overshadowing presence of Lucille Ball. She stayed until the fame that once felt intoxicating turned into a prison cell with no escape. But decades later, when the cameras were long gone and the sitcom had become legend, Vivian Vance finally spoke the truth. In interviews and private conversations, she revealed what it really meant to be Ethel Mertz, the cost of laughter, the bitterness behind the applause, and the resentment that haunted her until her final years. This is not the Vivian Vance you saw on TV. This is the woman who laughed for America, but cried for herself. This is the truth behind I Love Lucy that fans never saw. And it's a story that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the show, about Lucille Ball, and about the price of being forever remembered as someone you never wanted to be. Because for Vivian Vance, the biggest tragedy wasn't that she played Ethel Mertz. The tragedy was that America never truly saw Vivian at all. Long before Vivian Vance became the face of television's most famous neighbor, she was just Vivian Roberta Jones, a small-town girl from Cherryvale, Kansas. Born on July 26, 1909, she grew up in a conservative, religious household, where her spirit constantly clashed with the expectations placed upon her. Her family believed in modesty, humility, and quiet devotion. But Vivian was none of those things. She had fire in her eyes, a flair for the dramatic, and a hunger for a world far bigger than the one she had been born into. As a young girl, she would often sneak away from church gatherings to practice reciting lines in front of a mirror, mimicking the great stage actresses she had read about. Her mother scolded her endlessly, calling acting sinful and urging her to live a simple, respectable life. But Vivian knew even then she was not meant to be simple. She was meant to be seen. By her teenage years, her rebellion grew louder. She began performing in local theater, and with each applause from the small Kansas crowds, she felt herself come alive. It wasn't just about attention. It was about validation. She could transform, disappear into characters, and suddenly, she wasn't the daughter of a strict, religious family. She was anyone she wanted to be. That intoxicating freedom would guide her every decision from then on. But breaking away from her family came with consequences. When she decided to leave Kansas for the stage, her mother cut ties with her for years, ashamed of her daughter's immoral career. Vivian carried that wound for the rest of her life, and it fueled her desire to prove herself in the only way she knew how: by succeeding in the one world that had ever embraced her: theater. In the 1930s, Vivian arrived in New York City with little more than ambition and stubbornness. She trained relentlessly, often working odd jobs to survive. She adopted the stage name Vivian Vance. Elegant, sharp, a name that demanded attention. She fought her way into Broadway productions, her big break coming with roles in Music in the Air and The Cradle Will Rock. The critics noticed her talent, praising her for her natural wit and emotional depth. For the first time, Vivian felt like she was finally climbing. But New York's success came with a ceiling. Hollywood was calling, and like so many actors of her time, Vivian packed her bags and headed west. The transition was not easy. Hollywood, in the 1940s, was brutal to women who didn't fit the mold of glamorous leading ladies. Vivian was talented, but she wasn't the tall, sultry bombshell studios wanted to plaster on posters. She was witty, warm, and real. Qualities that made her invaluable on stage, but easy to overlook in a film industry obsessed with perfection. She spent years scraping by with small parts, auditions that led nowhere, and producers who dismissed her as character actress material at best. It was humiliating. She was caught in the cruel paradox. Too talented to ignore, but not glamorous enough to elevate. By her early 40s, Vivian feared she was running out of time. For actresses, especially in that era, the window was brutally short. If she didn't land something soon, her career might vanish entirely. Then came the phone call that would change everything. In 1951, Vivian Vance was offered a role in a new CBS sitcom called I Love Lucy. The creators were looking for someone to play Ethel Mertz, Lucy Ricardo's neighbor and partner in crime. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't leading lady material. But it was steady work. Vivian hesitated at first. Did she really want to tie herself to a frumpy sidekick role? But practicality won. She was in her 40s, work was scarce, and the role promised security. She accepted, and with that decision, she unknowingly sealed her fate. The first time Vivian walked onto the I Love Lucy set, she felt the chemistry instantly. Lucille Ball was electric, commanding every eye in the room. Desi Arnaz brought energy, charm, and chaos. William Frawley was the gruff veteran, and Vivian, she found her rhythm almost immediately. Her timing was impeccable, her facial expressions subtle yet powerful. Within weeks, Ethel Mertz had become more than just a supporting role. She was the heart of the show's humor, grounding Lucy's wild antics with her weary, exasperated charm. Audiences fell in love. Letters poured in to CBS, praising the Lucy-Ethel dynamic. Housewives saw themselves in Ethel. Not glamorous, not perfect, but loyal and relatable. And week after week, as Lucy dragged Ethel into absurd schemes, America laughed until it cried. Vivian Vance was finally a star. But fame, as always, came at a cost. Vivian quickly realized that the role of Ethel Mertz was a double-edged sword. Yes, it gave her recognition, but it also cemented her as the frumpy neighbor. Producers insisted she gain weight to make the contrast between Lucy and Ethel sharper. She was paired with William Frawley, a man 30 years older, as her husband. A casting choice she found insulting and degrading. Behind closed doors, she vented to friends that she despised the arrangement, calling it a cruel joke. Yet she endured. The paychecks were steady, the fame undeniable, and for the first time, she had national recognition. Still, Vivian couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that she had sold a piece of herself. She had dreamed of Broadway glory, of serious roles, of dramatic acclaim. Instead, she was trapped as Ethel, the eternal sidekick, the woman audiences adored but never respected. By the mid-1950s, I Love Lucy had become the #1 show in America. Vivian was living the dream that so many actresses never reached. But late at night, when the laughter faded and the cameras shut off, she looked in the mirror and asked herself the question she could never answer. Was this success or a cage? Because while the world saw Ethel Mertz, Vivian Vance was beginning to realize that Hollywood had stolen Vivian Jones forever. On television, the world adored Fred and Ethel Mertz, the bickering but lovable couple next door. Their arguments, delivered with perfect comedic timing, were a central part of I Love Lucy's charm. To millions of viewers, Fred's grumpiness and Ethel's sharp retorts were all part of the fun. But what no one knew at the time was that the fights didn't stop when the cameras shut off. In fact, the tension between Vivian Vance and William Frawley was all too real, and it was toxic. Vivian despised the casting from the start. At the time of the show's debut in 1951, she was in her early 40s, still vibrant and attractive, while Frawley was 64, balding, and known for his heavy drinking. The idea that audiences would believe them as a married couple infuriated her. Privately, she complained, "It's insulting. I look like his daughter, not his wife." That resentment never left her. William Frawley, for his part, wasn't fond of her either. A seasoned vaudevillian with a gruff personality. He bristled at Vivian's disdain and met it with open hostility. Crew members would recall years later that the two actors could barely tolerate being in the same room unless the cameras were rolling. Their insults backstage were legendary. He called her "that bitch," while she referred to him as "that old goat." When their scripted bickering turned into explosive chemistry on screen, viewers thought it was genius comedy. In reality, it was a thinly veiled version of their actual relationship. The hostility grew so bitter that when CBS executives once floated the idea of a spin-off series featuring Fred and Ethel, both actors flatly refused, not because they didn't want the work, but because neither of them could imagine spending another day together outside of contractual obligation. For the rest of their lives, Vivian and Frawley would never reconcile. Even decades later, when Frawley died in 1966, Vivian reportedly showed little emotion, telling friends only, "Champagne for everyone, and there's 11 nations." But while Frawley was a thorn in her side, Vivian's relationship with Lucille Ball was far more complicated, a mix of deep friendship, rivalry, and quiet resentment. From the beginning, Lucy and Vivian had undeniable chemistry. Their timing was instinctive, their connection seamless. Lucy recognized that the show only worked because Vivian elevated it. She often told executives, "There is no Lucy without Ethel." In turn, Vivian admired Lucy's brilliance, her relentless drive, and her groundbreaking vision as a woman who wasn't just the star, but also a producer and owner of Desilu Studios alongside Desi Arnaz. But admiration came with shadows. Lucy was the star, the one with the spotlight, the headlines, the empire. Vivian was the sidekick. And even though audiences loved Ethel, Vivian began to feel trapped under Lucy's shadow. There was an unspoken rule on set. Lucy had to remain the glamorous one, the center of attention, the woman audiences adored. To make that happen, Vivian was pressured into dowdy costumes, frumpy wigs, and jokes that made her seem older and less attractive than she really was. Executives even insisted she gain weight so that Lucy would always appear slimmer by comparison. She confided to close friends that she felt humiliated, reduced to a fat joke, while Lucy basked in stardom. Yet she also knew Lucy was the reason she had a career at all. Without Lucy, there would be no Ethel, no national fame, no steady paychecks. So Vivian played the role, swallowed her pride, and endured. Behind the scenes, their friendship was genuine but strained. Lucy and Vivian spent countless hours together, laughing, rehearsing, sharing secrets. They vacationed as families, and Lucy trusted Vivian enough to confide in her during the rocky years of her marriage to Desi Arnaz. But at the same time, Vivian never forgot the imbalance of power. Lucy was the boss. Vivian was the employee. And no matter how close they became, the hierarchy never changed. The tension surfaced in subtle ways. Vivian sometimes resisted costume decisions, pushing back against being made to look frumpier. Lucy, protective of her own image, would remind her sharply that it was for the show's good. There were whispers on set that Vivian occasionally broke down in tears after fittings, devastated by what the role was doing to her self-esteem. And yet, the public never knew. To audiences, Lucy and Ethel were inseparable. The best of friends who turned every episode into magic. Viewers wrote letters saying they wished they had a neighbor like Ethel, someone loyal and dependable. They saw Lucy and Ethel as a symbol of true friendship, a bond unshakable even by life's chaos. If only they had known the irony, that while the characters were closer than sisters, the women behind them were locked in a delicate dance of love, resentment, and professional necessity. As the seasons rolled on, Vivian's frustrations grew heavier. She began to feel typecast, unable to escape the shadow of Ethel Mertz. Casting directors in Hollywood saw her as nothing more than Lucy's sidekick. Offers for serious roles dried up. She tried, in small ways, to break free, but every time she auditioned, the same rejection followed. "You'll always be Ethel." By the end of I Love Lucy's original run in 1957, Vivian was exhausted. She had endured years of battling Frawley, struggling under Lucy's shadow, and being trapped in a role she hated. The fame that had once seemed like salvation now felt like a gilded cage. She longed to prove she was more than Ethel, but Hollywood refused to let her. Still, the world adored her. Millions tuned in each week, laughing at the antics of Lucy and Ethel, unaware that the woman behind the laughter was crumbling inside. Vivian Vance had achieved what so many actresses dreamed of, immortality on screen, but at what cost? The answer would haunt her for the rest of her career. And, as the 1960s arrived, with the American television landscape shifting, Vivian faced a choice: cling to the character that made her famous, or risk everything trying to escape it. Either way, she knew one truth she could never say out loud. She had paid dearly to be America's favorite neighbor. When I Love Lucy ended in 1957, Vivian Vance felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because she could finally step away from Ethel Mertz, a role that had brought her recognition but left her humiliated. Dread, because she knew Hollywood rarely forgave an actor for being typecast. And for millions of Americans, she was not Vivian Vance anymore. She was Ethel, and nothing else. CBS, aware of the show's immense popularity, wasn't ready to let go. Within a year, Lucille Ball launched The Lucy Show, and she wanted Vivian by her side again. At first, Vivian refused. She told Lucy bluntly, "I can't keep being Ethel. I'll go mad." Lucy, understanding her friend's pain but unwilling to lose her, compromised. This time, Vivian would play Vivian Bagley, a divorcee and Lucy's roommate. It was, in many ways, revolutionary. One of the first times television portrayed a divorced woman as a leading character. The new role gave Vivian some breathing room. She wasn't the frumpy neighbor anymore, but a woman closer to her own age and experience. Audiences loved her just the same, and her chemistry with Lucy remained undeniable. For a while, Vivian thought she had broken free of Ethel's prison. But old patterns crept back quickly. Viewers didn't care what her character's last name was, they still saw Ethel Mertz. And when CBS executives realized that pairing Lucy and Vivian together again was the show's strongest draw, they leaned heavily into familiar dynamics. Once more, Vivian found herself back in the shadow of Lucy, reduced to sidekick status. Off-screen, her life was no less turbulent. Vivian had endured 3 failed marriages by the time she returned to work with Lucy. Her relationships were marked by betrayal, disillusionment, and the struggle of being an ambitious woman in an era that punished women for independence. It wasn't until 1961, when she married literary agent John Dodds, that she found a semblance of stability. Dodds was supportive, understanding of her insecurities, and willing to stand beside her as she wrestled with the demons of her career. But even with love in her life, Vivian's health began to betray her. Years of stress, anxiety, and the pressures of maintaining an image for Hollywood took their toll. She suffered from depression, often disappearing from the spotlight for long stretches, retreating into isolation. She turned down offers, convinced she would never be taken seriously in Hollywood again. "They only want Ethel," she once sighed to a friend. "But I don't want to die as Ethel." Still, the bond with Lucille Ball remained. Despite their complicated friendship, Lucy and Vivian leaned on each other in ways few could understand. When Vivian struggled with depression, Lucy encouraged her to return to acting, pulling her back onto Here's Lucy in the late 1960s. The world still adored their chemistry, but behind the laughter, Vivian was increasingly fragile. Then came the cruelest blow of all, cancer. In the early 1970s, Vivian was diagnosed with breast cancer, a battle that would define the rest of her life. She underwent surgery, treatment, and long recoveries, but the disease returned again and again. At first, she kept her illness private, determined not to let the public see her weak. But as the years wore on, it became harder to hide. Roles dried up not just because of typecasting, but because her body could no longer endure the rigors of television schedules. Vivian once joked darkly to a friend, "Ethel will outlive me, and that's the part I can't stand." And she wasn't wrong. I Love Lucy was entering syndication, reaching new generations of viewers. Reruns aired endlessly, and children who hadn't even been born when the show premiered grew up laughing at Ethel Mertz. Vivian could walk into a grocery store and be recognized instantly, but never as Vivian Vance. To the world, she was frozen in black and white, forever Ethel, forever middle-aged, forever the sidekick. This constant reminder wore at her. In private moments, she wept to friends that she felt invisible, her true self erased by the role she once despised. She wanted to be remembered for her talent, her timing, her sacrifices, but she knew history had already written her name in ink as Lucy's neighbor. And yet, there was a strange beauty in her later years. Despite her bitterness, Vivian never stopped caring about the people who loved the show. When fans approached her, she smiled warmly, signed autographs, and listened to their stories. She knew they didn't understand the pain behind Ethel, and maybe it wasn't their fault. For them, Ethel had been a friend, someone who made hard times easier with laughter. In some ways, Vivian accepted that legacy, even if it broke her heart. Her relationship with Lucy also softened in these years. By the late 1970s, the rivalry had faded, replaced by genuine affection and gratitude. Lucy visited Vivian during her cancer treatments, and the two women reminisced about their years on set. Lucy admitted she could never have done the show without her. Vivian, frail but sharp as ever, replied, "And I could never have survived it without you." Still, the reality was cruel. While Lucy continued to work, building her empire and cementing her status as the queen of television, Vivian's body failed her. She appeared occasionally in guest roles, but the spotlight that once seemed blinding now barely flickered. She lived quietly with John Dodds in Connecticut, far from the Hollywood lights, surrounded by memories of a career that was both triumph and torment. By the time the 1980s arrived, Vivian knew her time was running short. Cancer had spread, and doctors could do little. But before she left, she began to speak more openly about her life. In interviews and conversations with friends, she admitted the truth, that being Ethel had been both her blessing and her curse. She laughed when she said it, but there was no mistaking the sadness in her eyes. Vivian Vance had lived the American dream: fame, recognition, immortality on television. But she had also lived its nightmare: the loss of identity, the cruel grip of typecasting, and the sense of never being truly seen. She had been America's neighbor, but never America's star. And as she faced the end of her life, she finally revealed what it had all cost her. By the late 1970s, Vivian Vance's body was weary. The cancer that had stalked her for nearly a decade returned with a vengeance. Doctors tried everything: surgeries, radiation, medications, but the disease spread, eating away at her strength. By 1979, she knew she was nearing the end. For a woman who had spent her life fighting to be seen beyond a role, the thought of disappearing quietly was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Vivian and her husband, John Dodds, had settled in Belvedere, California, overlooking the San Francisco Bay. The home was serene, surrounded by water and trees, far from the chaos of Hollywood. Here, she found a fragile peace. She spent her days reading, writing letters, and reflecting on a life that had been larger than she ever imagined, and yet lonelier than she had ever confessed. John became her caretaker, her protector, and the one who shielded her from the harsher realities of her failing health. He adored her, and in her final months, that love became her lifeline. Though frail, Vivian still carried her sharp wit. Friends who visited were surprised to find her cracking jokes between bouts of exhaustion. "If I'd known Ethel would outlive me," she quipped one afternoon, "I would have played her with more dignity." But the truth behind the humor was undeniable. Vivian Vance was fading. It was during this time that Lucille Ball made one of the most emotional visits of her life. Lucy and Vivian had shared nearly 3 decades of friendship, rivalry, and collaboration. They had fought, laughed, and carried each other through some of television's most groundbreaking years. But as Lucy walked into Vivian's home that summer, it was not as a co-star or a producer, it was as a friend saying goodbye. Witnesses later recalled how the two women embraced, holding each other tightly. Lucy, ever the strong one, tried to keep the mood light, reminiscing about the old days on set. The candy conveyor belt episode, the grape stomping, the countless times Lucy had dragged Ethel into another harebrained scheme. Vivian smiled, her eyes wet, her voice soft. "Those were the best of times, Lucy," she whispered. "And the hardest." They sat together for hours, laughing, crying, remembering. At one point, Lucy broke down, clutching Vivian's hand. "I don't know how to let you go," she said. Vivian, ever pragmatic, replied, "You already have, Lucy. Every time they rerun the show, I'm still there with you." It was the last time they saw each other. Shortly after, Vivian's health declined rapidly. On August 17, 1979, surrounded by her husband and a few close friends, Vivian Vance passed away at the age of 70. The official cause was breast cancer that had metastasized to her bones. But those who loved her knew the truth was more complicated. Vivian had carried decades of pain, insecurity, and frustration, and in the end, her body simply gave out. The news of her death hit Hollywood quietly but deeply. For millions of fans, she had been a familiar face in their living rooms, a symbol of loyalty and friendship. Tributes poured in, remembering her warmth, her timing, her irreplaceable presence. Yet behind the public statements, there was one mourner who grieved more than anyone: Lucille Ball. Lucy was devastated. Though she was famously private with her emotions, those close to her said she wept uncontrollably when she heard the news. She had lost not just a co-star, but a sister of sorts, a woman who had carried her greatest triumphs and her darkest moments. Lucy told friends, "Vivian made I Love Lucy. Without her, there would have been no show." In interviews after Vivian's death, Lucy struggled to find the right words. She praised Vivian's courage, her humor, and her incredible talent. But she also admitted something rare: regret. Regret that she hadn't done more to shield her friend from the indignities of the role. Regret that their friendship had sometimes been overshadowed by rivalry. Regret that she hadn't told Vivian often enough how much she loved her. For Lucy, Vivian's passing was more than the loss of a co-star. It was the closing of a chapter, the end of an era. With Vivian gone, the golden years of I Love Lucy seemed further away than ever. Preserved only in black and white film reels and the laughter of reruns, Vivian's funeral was small, intimate, attended by close friends and family. Lucy, distraught, stayed mostly silent, her face etched with grief. When asked later what she remembered most about Vivian, she answered simply, "Her laughter. I can still hear it, and I think I always will." But the tragedy of Vivian Vance's story didn't end with her death. As reruns of I Love Lucy continued to air worldwide, generations who never knew her in life came to know her only as Ethel Mertz. For all her longing to be seen as more, history had already chosen. To the world, Vivian Vance was and always would be Ethel. And yet, perhaps she was wrong. Perhaps her true legacy lies not just in the character she despised, but in the millions of people she touched. Housewives in the 1950s saw themselves in her. Young women admired her strength and timing. Friends remembered her wit, her warmth, her honesty. And Lucy remembered her as irreplaceable. Vivian once said that she feared being forgotten the moment she stepped off stage. She never was. Her laughter, her strength, her complicated truth, all of it remains woven into the fabric of American television history. She may have hated Ethel, but Ethel made her immortal. In the end, Vivian Vance's story is not just one of pain, but of endurance. She fought against the limitations of Hollywood, the cruelty of typecasting, the betrayal of her own body, and though she lost many battles, she won the war that mattered most. She left a mark so deep that decades later, we are still telling her story. When Vivian Vance died in 1979, the television world mourned quietly, almost modestly, as if she had lived her life the way she played Ethel, always in the background, always supporting someone else's spotlight. But time has a way of reshaping memory, and in the decades since, her story has become more than the footnote of a sitcom. It has become a cautionary tale about the price of television immortality. For millions, I Love Lucy was comfort. It was the show families gathered around after dinner, the one that made children laugh until their stomachs hurt, the one that, for a half hour each week, reminded people that life could be silly, joyous, and fun. Vivian Vance was an essential part of that magic. Without her, Lucy's harebrained schemes would have collapsed. Without her steady timing, her exasperated expressions, her grounding presence, I Love Lucy would have lacked balance. Vivian was not just the neighbor, She was the anchor that made Lucy believable. And yet, her truth revealed something darker, that being the anchor meant sacrificing herself. For years, Vivian endured humiliation costumes that made her appear older, scripts that mocked her body, and a casting decision that chained her to a man she despised. It was, in many ways, the cruel irony of television. The very things that made her character beloved made her life miserable. When Vivian began speaking openly about this in her later years, people listened differently. She wasn't just bitter, as some tabloids tried to portray. She was honest. She articulated what so many performers, especially women, had long felt but rarely voiced, that Hollywood had a way of stealing not just your image, but your identity. Her revelations forced fans to re-examine the show they loved. Could they laugh at Lucy and Ethel without acknowledging the pain it caused the woman behind Ethel? Lucille Ball herself admitted as much. In the years after Vivian's death, Lucy grew more candid about their relationship. She acknowledged that Vivian had been forced into unflattering roles to protect her own star image. She confessed she hadn't always been fair, hadn't always appreciated how much Vivian sacrificed. She was brilliant, Lucy told one interviewer. She gave Ethel a life no one else could have. I don't think I ever thanked her enough. These confessions reframed I Love Lucy in cultural memory. It was no longer just the story of Lucy and Ricky Ricardo. It was also the story of Ethel of Vivian Vance, who embodied the contradictions of mid-century womanhood. She was funny, but her humor came at the expense of dignity. She was loyal, but that loyalty trapped her in someone else's shadow. She was loved, but never truly seen. In the years since, critics and historians have worked to restore Vivian's place in television history. Scholars point out that her role as Vivian Bagley in The Lucy Show broke new ground, presenting divorce on television at a time when it was taboo. Others highlight how her comedic timing paved the way for generations of female sidekicks who learned that the best friend role could be just as essential as the lead. And fans, especially women, have celebrated her honesty in speaking about her struggles with typecasting and body image. Vivian's story resonates even more in today's entertainment landscape. Modern audiences, aware of the costs of fame and the toxicity of typecasting, look at her life as a mirror of the industry's flaws. In an era when celebrities speak more openly about mental health, body shaming, and the pressures of Hollywood, Vivian Vance feels startlingly modern. She was, in many ways, ahead of her time, a woman brave enough to admit that the laughter people loved had been built on her own quiet suffering. Her legacy also lives in the way audiences connect with I Love Lucy. The reruns never stop. Every decade, a new generation discovers Lucy and Ethel. Children laugh at the candy factory scene. Teenagers marvel at the grape-stomping episode. Adults see themselves in the friendship, the loyalty, the absurdity of everyday life. And in all those moments, Vivian is still there, still alive, still making people smile. It is perhaps the cruelest and kindest irony that the role she hated is the one that made her immortal. Vivian Vance may have longed to be remembered for serious drama, for Broadway, for roles of depth and dignity. Instead, she will always be remembered as Ethel Mertz. But maybe that isn't such a tragedy after all. Maybe being the face of laughter, the sound of joy in living rooms across the world, is a legacy greater than she ever realized. Still, her truth matters. When fans watch I Love Lucy today, they cannot help but think of the woman behind Ethel, the woman who endured insults, who wrestled with self-doubt, who lived with the knowledge that fame had trapped her in a role she never wanted. That knowledge doesn't erase the laughter. It deepens it. Vivian Vance's story is the story of Hollywood itself. The glamour, the applause, the hidden scars. It is the story of a woman who gave the world joy while quietly carrying sorrow. And it is the story of how, even when truth comes too late, it still has the power to change the way we see the past. Today, when television historians speak of the Golden Age, Vivian's name is mentioned with reverence. She may have been the sidekick, but she was also the soul of the show. She taught us that friendship, even when complicated, is the heartbeat of comedy. She taught us that laughter can coexist with pain. And in the end, she taught us that the greatest performances are not always the ones we choose, but the ones we survive. Vivian once said that her biggest fear was being forgotten. She never was. She never will be. Her laughter lives on, and so does her truth. When the curtain finally fell on Vivian Vance's life, she left behind more than a role. She left behind a question, one that echoes through every studio lot, every casting office, every actor's dressing room. What does fame truly give, and what does it take away? Vivian's story is not unique in its outline. Hollywood has always thrived on dualities. The spotlight that elevates you also blinds you. The applause that validates you also drowns out your own voice. The role that makes you immortal can also erase who you really are. But few stories embody this paradox as starkly as hers. For decades, she was America's neighbor, the embodiment of loyalty and laughter. Yet privately, she was a woman battling humiliation, insecurity, and the constant ache of being seen as less than she knew herself to be. To understand her legacy, you must look at the woman behind the role. Vivian Vance was not born to be Ethel Mertz. She was born to be Vivian Roberta Jones, a fiery girl from Kansas who dared to defy her family's strict traditions, who fought her way onto Broadway stages, who believed she could carve out a place for herself in a world that often dismissed women like her. She was bold, ambitious, complicated, and in the end, those qualities were both her strength and her torment. What makes her story enduring is not just the laughter of I Love Lucy reruns, but the revelations that came after, the honesty with which she spoke of her frustrations, the courage it took to admit that success had come at a cost. In doing so, she humanized not just herself, but every performer trapped between public adoration and private despair. Her truth cracked the glossy veneer of 1950s television, reminding us that behind the sitcom smiles were real people with wounds the cameras never captured. Hollywood, of course, moved on. New shows replaced the old. New stars stepped into the spotlight. But Vivian's presence lingered, woven into the DNA of television comedy. Every female sidekick who came after, every Rhoda to Mary, every Monica to Rachel, owed something to her. She showed that the best friend wasn't just comic relief. She could be the heartbeat, the grounding force, the one who made the lead shine brighter. Without Vivian, Lucy's chaos would have spun into emptiness. With her, it became magic. And yet, the question remains, was it worth it? For fans, the answer is simple. Of course it was. She gave them joy, laughter, a kind of companionship that stretched across decades. But for Vivian herself, the answer was never so clear. She longed for recognition as more than Ethel, longed to be respected for her craft, longed to shed the frumpy costumes and stand in the spotlight as herself. She never truly got that chance. Perhaps that is the true tragedy of Vivian Vance, that her immortality came in a form she never wanted. She feared being forgotten, and she wasn't. But she was remembered as someone else. To the world, she will always be Ethel Mertz. To her closest friends, she was Vivian, the sharp, witty, vulnerable woman who carried more pain than most ever knew. Lucille Ball's grief at her death revealed something profound. Lucy admitted she couldn't have done the show without her, that Vivian's brilliance had been essential all along. Those words, though heartfelt, came late, too late for Vivian to hear them. Too late to erase the years of feeling diminished, but they serve as a reminder for us now. Recognition delayed is recognition denied. And perhaps the best way to honor Vivian is to give her in death what she rarely received in life: credit. Credit for being the first divorced woman on television. Credit for redefining the role of the sidekick. Credit for enduring indignities that would have broken lesser performers. Credit for being the glue that held together one of the most iconic shows in television history. In the end, Vivian's story asks us to look beyond the laughter, to see the human cost of entertainment. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the way we consume celebrity. Do we ever really see the people behind the characters we love? Or do we trap them in roles, reducing them to masks that hide the truth? For Vivian, the answer came too late. But for us, her honesty remains a gift. By speaking openly about her struggles, she left a roadmap for future generations, an unvarnished reminder that success without authenticity can feel like failure, that applause can echo hollow if it drowns out your own voice. So the next time the reruns roll, when Lucy and Ethel appear on screen plotting some harebrained scheme, perhaps we can laugh a little differently. Perhaps we can laugh with gratitude, knowing the cost that performance carried. Perhaps we can remember that behind Ethel's exasperated sighs and weary smile was a woman who deserved more than she got, but gave more than she had. Vivian Vance may never have escaped Ethel Mertz, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe her true legacy is not in the role itself, but in the truth she left behind: the courage to reveal the pain beneath the laughter, the strength to endure, and the reminder that even sidekicks can be stars in their own right. And so we return to the question, what does fame give, and what does it take away? Vivian Vance gave us the answer, not in words, but in her life. It gives you immortality, but it takes away your name. It gives you laughter, but it takes away your dignity. And yet, in that exchange, something remarkable happens. You become unforgettable. Vivian Vance was unforgettable, not just as Ethel, not just as Lucy's neighbor, but as a woman who carried the weight of being seen and unseen at the same time. Her truth is her legacy, and that legacy will never die.